Today, I'm going to remember my grandmother, Ida Volinsky, who died in March of 1984. I was 32, married, with a 3-month-old baby daughter. We went to New York for her funeral and then to Long Island for her burial in the IWO International Workers Order section of a large Jewish cemetery. My 2 brothers and I, her only grandchildren, were there, as was my father, her son-in-law. My mother, her only child, had died several years earlier. Grandma had lived a long life, deteriorated before she died, and we were ready to say goodbye. Grandma was born Chaya Malka Grodzansky in Gunians, a small town with a sizable Jewish community in what is now northern Poland. The youngest of 13 children, Grandma was barely a teenager when she came to America on a vacation to babysit for her 2 brothers. The family story goes like this. During her visit, war broke out in Eastern Europe and Grandma could not return home. She stayed and married. She was still in her teens when my mother was born in 1915. I have a trove of essays that she wrote when she took classes to improve her English. In one, she writes, "I couldn't continue school because I had to support myself. I was only 14 years old, inexperienced, no references. I finally found a job in a ladies' waste factory. I worked a few weeks and was laid off. I struggled for 3 years, constantly looking for a new job until my folks decided I should get married. The marriage didn't last. My grandfather regularly stayed out all night, gambling, drinking, and womanizing. In 1922, when my mother was 7, Grandma divorced my grandfather, went to work in a factory, and placed my mother in foster care. Around this time, she gave up on religion, saying that God had been so bad to her that it didn't matter whether she believed in him or not. Grandma retrieved my mother from foster care several years later, and she and my mother lived together well into my mother's adulthood. Each summer, they traveled up the Hudson River by boat from New York City to Albany, spending July and August on my great-uncle's farm. Back in the city, Grandma had bought my mother a piano. My mother was a gifted pianist, and when she finished high school in 1931, her teacher wanted her not to go to college and study professionally. But Grandma insisted that her daughter continue her education. My mother finished college and eventually went on to graduate school, earning her PhD. Grandma could not have been prouder. When she was nearly 50, Grandma married Borak Volinsky, a widower who worked for the Metropolitan Life Insurance Company. Grandma and Borak moved into a brand new 2-bedroom apartment in Stuyvesant Town in Lower Manhattan. Grandma loved the apartment and the oval, the green space away from the noisy streets where she would sit for hours in the sun, chatting with friends in Yiddish. And Grandma and Borak adored each other. He gave her greeting cards for any celebratory occasion. Some were humorous, none deprecating. Each was inscribed to his beloved Ida. After Borak died, Grandma kept the greeting cards in a basket next to her living room sofa, and she wore her engagement and wedding rings every day. I loved the greeting cards and the unalloyed joy of Borak's notes to Grandma. I visited Grandma often, sometimes spending the night in her apartment. Sometimes we sat on her living room sofa and I played solitaire, she teaching me the rules of the game and giving me guidance on how to play so that one's chances of winning were increased. Full disclosure, I still play solitaire and I still follow those guidelines. Grandma's life had a wonderful order to it. I would watch her do her hair in the mornings, carefully and deftly making 2 braids and pinning them to the top of her head. And she and I chatted. I remember standing in her hallway and asking her about her family back in Europe. "How old was your mother when she died?" I asked. 94, she replied. "What did she die of?" I would ask. "Hitler killed her," was Grandma's simple reply. It wasn't until several years after she was gone that I realized that Hitler had killed most of Grandma's family. She never spoke of that loss. When I was in 1st grade, Grandma traveled to Israel, spending 2 months with Penina, a relative with whom she had connected after the war. Grandma wrote home regularly, sharing concerns about her grandchildren. Naomi had had the measles, and her delight in the country. "I have so much to talk about," she wrote. "Panini came with a boat to the ship, and from far away she saw me and called, 'Tanti, Tanti, Aunt, Aunt,' so many times, and I looked at her and wasn't very sure. As she came nearer to my ship, I heard her say, 'Panini, Panini.' Then I was sure it is her, but couldn't get over it the way she recognized me. My grandma was thrilled with the still new country, Israel. 'I am on a vacation,' she wrote, 'and seeing a world. I still can't believe it is me. To me, it should happen such a thing.' Even as a child, I knew her trip to Israel was redemptive. Not long after Grandma's return from Israel, my parents and I traveled to Brookline for a family bat mitzvah. Grandma, who had not set foot in a shul for nearly 40 years, was appalled when she entered Temple Israel in Brookline, a Reform synagogue where women sat next to men. "What's this?" she explained. "If you're going to do it, you do it right. Otherwise, you don't do it at all." That year, like all others during my childhood, we went to Grandma's for Pesach. I remember walking down First Avenue dressed up, the scent of spring in the air. Borach had died a few years earlier, but Grandma remained close to his family, and they all always joined us for the holiday. Grandma served a traditional meal, and the youngest among us, me for many years, would ask the 4 questions. Grandma loved people. She was genial and positive. She had many suitors, she told me, but turned them down. On a visit to her Stuyvesant Town apartment when I was in college, I asked Grandma why she hadn't remarried. "I don't want to get married," she said. "I don't want to have to take care of a man." When I first met Mark, I called my parents to tell them of what I suspected was to be a serious relationship. Little did I know. Grandma was visiting and joined the phone call, interrupting my news. Naomi, she said, "I met a man. He wants to marry me." And so 6 weeks later, Grandma married Ed Levy in Ferndale, New York, a small town in the Catskills. An Orthodox rabbi officiated, and after the wedding ceremony, the men sat around a long table with Ed Levy and his new bride, Grandma, drinking schnapps. No other women were at the table, but Grandma beckoned my brother's wife, my sister-in-law, and insisted she join them. The newly married couple stayed in Ferndale until the weather turned cold and then went south to Florida for the winter. Not long after Grandma and Ed's wedding, however, my mother was diagnosed with a recurrence of the breast cancer she had been treated for years earlier. Her prognosis was grim, but she kept the news of her illness from her mother, hoping against hope she would survive. My mother died barely 10 months after Ed and Grandma's marriage, and Grandma could not recover from losing her daughter when she was 81 and my mother 64. "Tochter," Grandma said to her as my mother lay in bed, unable to work, sleeping, barely eating. "Tochter," she said, reverting to her native Yiddish, capturing what no words in English could convey. Grandma, who had a child when she was 17, far from family, married to a man who betrayed her, never wavered in her devotion to her daughter. Tochter. I have wondered how I, a woman in a conservative synagogue, can be true to my grandmother while keeping her memory alive. I have come to this. If Grandma were to roll her eyes at me for observing in the religious observances she disdained, if she were to dismiss me for honoring her, she and I can have a chat. I will thank her for ensuring that I never once questioned my ability as a woman to have an education or a career. I will thank her for showing me perseverance, pride, and joy in family, and for her cheerfulness in the face of the many challenges life delivered her. I will thank her for her fighting spirit. I will tell her that I loved her and that her light, her legacy, her people, and our traditions live on.